So the mistake that myself and most other producers have made at some point is you work really hard on your production and you get to the mixing stage and you want every detail that you worked on so hard to be heard. So you start just turning everything up in the mix and it becomes this big wall of sound. So today's video is gonna be all about how to mix a busy track that has a lot of layers. And I'm gonna use this song as an example. So these are the raw stems that a client sent me to mix. So obviously it's not mixed yet. I'm gonna show you what it sounds like after mixing, but I wanna show you how many layers are going on here. So just looking at the drums, there are a ton of percussion layers driving the rhythm. Lots and lots of layers, some low toms competing with the kick. Then we've got lots of different bass sounds fighting for the same space. And that's before we even get to all these synth layers. So how can you possibly balance all those layers together and not make the mix sound muddy? Well, that's what this video is all about. So this is the final mix. I'm gonna show you what it sounds like right now, and then I'm gonna go through how you can balance a busy mix.
Take me into the light when I can't find us. Yeah, we'll dance through the fire. Let our feelings guide us.
By the way, this is a track from an artist named Christian Carter. I'll link his Spotify page below so you can check out this song when it's released. So the first thing we gotta do actually has to do with human psychology, and that's the fact that humans, when we're listening to any section of any song, we only really hear or remember one element at a time. The rest of the elements, we kind of just feel. So what we gotta do is establish a hierarchy and actually write it down so we can focus on making our mix follow this hierarchy. So in this track, I would say the vocals are definitely the #1 thing that people are gonna remember in the drop. So then after that, what comes next? So I would say there's this lead synth layer underneath the vocals that sometimes when the vocals have a break, we want that to come through and be the second most memorable layer. So I'll write lead synth as the second layer. Then what's really driving the track and giving it power, that would be the drums and bass. And then we have our supporting synths, which those are supposed to be more felt than heard. Like they're helping the overall vibe of the track, but you don't want those really high in the mix because they're gonna make everything muddy and give it that wall of sound effect where nothing is really coming through. Then within each of these groups, you're also kind of gonna have a hierarchy too. Like you don't want all the drums to be at the front of the mix. You probably want the kick to be loud. You want the hi-hats in this case to be pretty loud because they're driving that high-end energy. And then we could have like the low percussion that comes in, and then maybe the rhythmic high percussion after that. That's kind of more in the background. So obviously it depends on the track, but it's really helpful to have this hierarchy written out to reference while you're mixing, because as you're about to see, it looks simple when you have the hierarchy written out, but in practice, balancing all these layers actually can get a lot more complicated. So we're gonna start with the kick, and we're gonna keep building and layering things in to show you how we execute on that mix hierarchy that we made. So I've got this snare layer, and you can see how much latency there is because there's so many things being sidechained against each other in this track. But in a more open mix with less layers, normally I don't like to aggressively low cut things. I like certain elements to be full and have most of their frequencies coming through. But when a mix is this busy, don't be afraid to aggressively low cut a lot of things because the mix is gonna get really muddy really fast if you don't low cut things. Then we have some drum layers with lower frequencies. And you can see these frequencies are obviously gonna mess with the kick and bass, so I'll show you how we deal with that. So first of all, I have this multi-band compressor being sidechained to the kick to get this low tom sound out of the way of the kick. Because I didn't need to sidechain the whole thing and kill all of its presence. I only wanted those low mids and sub frequencies to get out of the way. Then if we bring in our lowest bass layer, I'm actually using spectral EQ here in its sidechain mode and sidechaining the bass to that low tom. Because what's the point of having the low tom in the mix if you're not gonna be able to hear it? So what I'm doing is every time the low tom comes in, I'm cutting those frequencies out of the bass so it actually can cut through and not just make the bass sound muddy. But then we have even more low percussion sounds to fit into this puzzle. So with this sound, I'm doing a similar thing with multiband compression just to sidechain the low end of it. But then you gotta realize that sound is also gonna be in the way of that other low tom. So I had to add this spectral EQ sidechain to the low tom so it gets out of the way just like the bass is doing. Then something that's really helpful when you have a crowded mix like this is to stop thinking of all the layers in your mix as individual sounds and start thinking of them as combined sounds that make up the same feeling instead. Like we have these rhythmic hi-hats, but then we also have this other layer playing the same rhythm, and another one too. And it doesn't just have to be drum sounds that are combining into this bigger sound, it's also this rhythmic bass. Then this synth layer has the same rhythm too. So it's much easier to mix in all these sounds when you actually think of them just as one combined sound as opposed to separate elements. So like these 5 sounds I would mix in together to try to get that 16th note rhythmic feeling in the track and just figure out how loud I want that in the mix. So like at this level, you can feel that rhythm, but you can see there's still plenty of space in here where the main synths and vocals and things can go. And then even with the drums, we have a lot of background elements that should be just felt more than they're actually heard. Like if I turned all these layers too loud, it would just make the mix sound crowded. But at this level, really low in the mix, honestly, you can't even really hear those layers, but you can kind of just feel the groove that they're adding to the drums. Now let's get into how we balance 6 different bass layers together. Well, the first mistake would be thinking of these as 6 different bass layers. Really, it's kind of just 2 different basses. We've got the rhythmic part of it. I really want that driving the low end. And then up here, we just have this longer, more legato bass. So when you start combining these things in your head and thinking of them as one sound, it makes it a lot easier to mix. That's that low layer that I want driving the low end of the track. So when it comes to mixing in this other layer, I know I can just aggressively low cut this. Like I don't want to mess around with any spectral EQ sidechaining or anything because I know that that's going to make up the low end. You're not even going to miss this. You can't even hear the difference when I have that high pass filter on because the other layer is driving the low end. Same with this third layer. It's just adding a little bit of high-end rhythm to the bass, so I'm cutting out most of it, honestly. So those 3 main bass layers, I'm sending those to the same bus and sidechaining all of them to the second bass, which is that higher Reese bass. That way, every time the Reese bass comes in, the main bass cuts out of the way in the mid frequencies just a little bit to make room for it. And for the lowest Reese bass layer, I'm sidechaining that back to the main bass. Because the low end from the main bass is already driving the rhythm, I don't need nearly as much of the low end from the Reese bass. Then both of the higher Reese bass layers, I'm just heavily high passing because we don't really need any of those frequencies messing with the rest of the bass layers. So now when we bring our vocals in, how are we gonna have our synths not clash too much with the vocals?
Take me into the light where the night can't find us.
So if I bring the lead synth in,
Take me into the light where the night can't find us.
it's getting in the way of the vocal. So what I could do is add a compressor on that lead synth track and sidechain it to the vocals. And now we can set this up so every single time the vocal comes in, we could turn this down maybe 1.5 decibels.
Into the light when I can't find us. And we'll dance through the fire that our feelings guide us.
And if you feel like that's too little or too much, all you have to do is change the range on your compressor. This is the most underrated control on a compressor, is the range knob, because you can do things like this. Then for all of our supporting synths, our background synths, I'm making sure those are actually pretty low in the mix so they're not getting in the way. Like, this is still leaving plenty of room for everything else in the mix. But just to make sure that the vocal is still the star of the show, I'm sending all of these synths to one synth group, and I'm doing the same thing where I'm ducking all of the synths just down 0.75 decibels every time the vocal comes in.
Into the light when I can't find us. And we'll dance.
Then just to drive that home even more, I'm sending all the synths and bass layers to a bus together, and then I'm putting Soothe on that bus, sidechaining that to the vocal, and then that way there's some spectral EQing going on every time the vocals come in.
Into the light when I can't.
So now the very strongest vocal frequencies are just getting reduced from the synths and basses to make even more room for the vocal to come through. So I hope you guys are seeing that you can make a really busy track sound actually pretty clean if you, one, realize that a listener can only really hear one thing at a time, but they just feel the rest of the track. So that leads you to make a mix hierarchy, and then you can execute your mix based on how you've pre-planned your mix hierarchy and what you want to be heard versus felt in the background of the mix. And if you want to learn how to make really powerful professional masters, I do have a totally free mastering course at bigzcourses.com/mastering. I'll also leave a link below. There's no strings attached. It's totally free, and people seem to really be enjoying that. So thank you guys for watching the video. I'll catch you next time. Peace.